Welcome back to this video series on the Project Management APM PFQ exam material content. In this video we're going to be looking at project scope. So this is the first part of our definition phase, our actual planning phase that we do as a project manager. And this is where we're going to start turning the business case idea into an actual plan of how we are going to make that a reality. So looking at the word scope itself, we think of things like telescopes and microscopes. And what they have in common is that they are targeting in on a very specific area to study and examine it much closer. And we have the same thing with our project scope. Things that we consider to be in scope are the things that we are doing, we are targeting towards. And of course, that is everything and anything in order to deliver the benefits as laid out in the project business case. But equally important, we must consider what's not in scope. What are we not targeting? This becomes quite important as we go through the project where we have end users or our external client, the person who's paying for it, may be making assumptions about what we are going to deliver. So part of our scope, we're going to lay out very clearly what we will deliver, but also it's useful to say what we won't deliver. So before we start actually doing tasks and producing things and providing outcomes, everybody is aware of what we will achieve and what we won't achieve. And that early discussion in the project can happen to make sure everything's included that should be, and that the client, the end users, the project sponsor are happy with what will be delivered. One of the key skills of a project manager is to balance all of the requirements in order to deliver the project successfully. We need to take into account the benefits that we must deliver in order to be successful with the project, but also balance the requirements of time, how long the project will take, the costs involved in running the project, the quality that's required of our end results, our products and our services, but also the risks of running the project itself. In this context, we're talking about risks that may prevent the project from being successful, as opposed to the strategic risks which are considered as part of the business case. Those risks of what will happen if we do or don't do the project at all. Once we've been able to establish what the timeline is and the actual budget for the project in a lot more detail, along with things like the quality requirements and the risks, we will be able to provide information in the scoping document that we call baselines. These are the targets that we have set to say that we can achieve the project in. So we may have a baseline that says this project will take 6 weeks. That becomes the measure by which you judge your project progress as you move into the development phase and start undertaking tasks. You will also have this agreed budget that comes with a lot more detail, and the scope will tell us what the baseline for that budget is. It may be that you've said you can deliver this project costing £27,000. That is what you will measure your project against. So these baselines are critical because they are the agreement that you have with the project sponsor about what you will achieve. So our scoping document is going to contain a list or a table that includes all of the products that we are going to produce as part of our project. This might be manufactured items, it could be a website, a building, or it could be documentation, processes and procedures. We're also going to have that list of the benefits pulled directly from the business case, but probably refined into a bit more detail. It's going to include success criteria, and we'll come on to that shortly, success factors, and the baselines and the constraints. Of course, we can't write the baselines yet because we haven't done the scheduling and we haven't done the budgeting and those other detailed pieces of work. So the scope document, while we start it at the beginning of the planning phase, we actually can't complete it until the rest of the planning phase is done. You'll notice the word constraints on here, along with baselines. These are different from baselines. As we just discussed, baselines are targets that we set, where we say what we can achieve the project in. Usually things like we can have it done within a set amount of time and to a set budget. If we are getting given constraints, they come from an external source, either from the sponsor, end users, or from a paying client, where they draw a line in the sand to say that we cannot cross it. For example, they may say, this project must be delivered, we're only going to pay £20,000 for this project. You have to work to that. You cannot go over that budget. That's a constraint. But again, sometimes these constraints can be time bound, such as it must be ready by the beginning of November so that it's ready for a Christmas launch of this product. You can't go beyond that. The project will be considered a failure if you do not operate within that constraint. Of course, if your project's got constraints of both time and money, you may find that actually the project's untenable and can't be delivered because those constraints are far too tight. So throughout the rest of this planning phase, if you do have any constraints, you need to bear those in mind. They're not something that you can necessarily negotiate. Frequently, at this part of the process, people start asking the question, why do you need a business case and a scope? Because surely a lot of this information should be part of the business case. Well, this can be true, but often business cases are far too skinny and are lacking the detailed information that we as project managers need in order to successfully plan a project. Remember, the business case is laying out about what they want to achieve and the viability of that. Our job is to make sure we know how we're going to achieve it. So we do need that much more detailed look at things and that more detailed scheduling, risk analysis, budgeting, and those looks at quality of how will we make this happen, especially bearing in mind any constraints that we are given. So regardless of how well benefits are laid out in the business case, there's a good chance we'll need to rewrite them. So we need to keep the essence and we need to keep the target, but we probably need to fill in some more detail. We need to make sure that the benefits are written in a way that is quantifiable and measurable improvement to the business as usual activities. In other words, once we've delivered the project and it's out there in the real world and the changes we have implemented have taken place, how do we know if those benefits are being realised? Is there a way to measure them? Is there an increase in revenue? Is there an increase in staff retention or a reduction in defects in products? Whatever those benefits are, they are going to be perceived as a positive change by the key stakeholders. Remember, it's their project you're delivering. So it's not what you think is a benefit, it's what they think is a benefit. So we mentioned before that one of the things that goes into our scope documents is success criteria. So success criteria are the tick box items, if you think of it like a bullet point list, are things that you can tick off to say, yes, we've achieved that, yes, it meets that requirement, therefore the project is successful. So this can be difficult and often you need to work with the end users to work out what they are. But importantly, they must be specific and measurable. You must know if you have achieved or not achieved that. And on the right of the screen here, there's a couple of examples of the kind of things that might be considered success criteria, such as we're developing a money counting machine. And one of the success criteria is not necessarily that it counts notes, but that it counts 500 notes per minute. So if your developed product only counts 400 notes per minute, you have not met this criteria. Therefore, you're missing one of your success criteria and your end product may not be fit for purpose. And the rest of the project, you may as well stop. Of course, what's important is this particular criteria says it counts 500 notes per minute. What if your end product counts 600 notes per minute? Is that a success because it counts more? Or is that a failure because you're not hitting the 500 notes per minute? This is what we mean about being specific. It's not always about going above and beyond what's required, but hitting exactly what's required. Perhaps that success criteria could have been better written as counts at least 500 notes per minute. That gives you better scope and better understanding of what the requirement is. You've got a minimum to work to. An incredibly useful tool that we use as part of our scope is this thing called Moscow. However, you don't only need to use it in a project context. Actually, it works in normal business, in fact, in your personal life as well. It's a way of prioritizing things. So if you only have a certain amount of resources and you cannot achieve everything, maybe partway through the project there's been a change to your budget or there's been a change to the timeline, you need to decide what it is you're going to drop from the project so that the whole project itself can still move forward even if you've had to cut a few things away. Deciding up front as part of your planning process makes it much easier to understand what can be let go later on, if that should happen. Moscow does that. So we have the M for Moscow, must have, critical to project success. If we don't have that thing or that process or that outcome, the whole project's a disaster and we may as well not run the project at all. We must have it. Should have, obviously, it's an important outcome. It needs to be in there wherever possible. Worst case scenario, if we have massive changes to our project, our timelines or our budgets, we can cut those without losing all of the benefits. However, it will turn out to be a much weaker overall project and much weaker benefits coming out. The could have, they're the nice things, they're the polish, they're the extra bits, they are the extra documentation that would be useful. So if we do need to cut anything, we need to save time or we need to save money, the could haves, the nice to haves are going to be the first things that we look at to ditch. And of course, we need to agree these with our end users and with our sponsor of what it is that we feel that we can trim away from the project and still deliver most of the benefits required. The bottom one here, the won't have, this is our not in scope stuff. So we mentioned that earlier. Moscow helps us define that. So what must we have, should we have, could we have, but also what won't we do? We're not doing that. It will not include those extra bells and whistles. And the client, again, as we said earlier, they may assume some of those things are happening, but here we're able to clearly state we won't be doing that. And if they don't like that and they want them included, that's fine. If they say actually they're a could have or a should have or a must have, that's fine. We can rescope the project to include that with the understanding that that may push up the budget or push out the timeline or change some of the other requirements. So we mentioned this thing called success factors that should be contained within our scope, within our scoping documents. Success factors are all the things, environmental or otherwise, that will directly impact our ability to be successful with the project. And you can see some of the some examples here. However, every project is unique and every project will have its own success factors. So if you consider senior management support, if they strongly support your project, it is more likely to get the time, resources and the funding required in order to be successful. If you don't have senior management support, it's going to be an uphill struggle and you may find it's impossible to achieve. You're not given the personnel, the time, the resources that you need to accomplish it. Having clear goals, which is what the scoping document is about, making sure we know what the target is that we're aiming for and that we've planned to achieve it. If we don't have clear goals, it's unlikely we're going to randomly hit those goals because we don't know what we're aiming for. It's shooting in the dark. A motivated team, critical to getting tasks done on the project on time to the quality that is required. And of course, a motivated team is much more likely to problem solve and to report back issues to you so that you can handle them. A demotivated team is the best way for a project to fail. Projects starting on time, it might seem obvious, but often we go through lots of planning, we have everything scheduled, we know what we're going to do, and then a project is delayed. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the project will be derailed, but it does cause a lot of frustration. And if you have a deadline and you said, I can have this done by July, and your project is delayed by 2 months before starting, there may be an expectation you're still going to achieve it by July, where clearly you cannot do that. So that can have a dramatic impact on your ability to be successful. And decision-making processes. If you're having to escalate things to your client, end users, or the project sponsor, and you need decisions about changes or the way that you're going to do things, any delays there effectively can pause the project. And again, that baseline of schedule where you said it will take X amount of time, the longer those decisions take to come through, the more delays of your project, the less likely you're going to be able to hit those baselines. And unfortunately, an external observer may well see that as a failure of the project and the project manager, because they don't see the process and where those delays are coming in. So now we've covered all of those components that go into that scoping document. We need to now start trying to work out what is it we actually have to do. We've got all these constraints and these baselines that we need to work out. How do we know what activities we need to undertake? We know that we need to deliver benefits. This is represented by these lovely little happy faces on the right hand side. This is what we need to achieve, but how do we get there? Well, we actually can start there and work backwards. So in order to deliver that benefit, what is the outcome, the change that needs to happen in order to deliver those benefits? Once we understand what those outcomes are, those changes to process, to procedure, to the structure of the building, whatever it may be, we know what those changes are. We can then start to work out what is it we need to put in place to make that change happen. Well, we need to rewrite a procedure, or we need to build a device, or we need to develop this website or this network. And those are the products and the outputs that we actually need to develop and deliver in order for that change to happen, in order for those benefits to be realized. And of course, those products and outputs are part of our project, and that's what we're planning for. So as you can see on the screen at the moment, just bearing in mind that this word output and product is often used interchangeably here. So try not to get confused. We tend to talk about soft projects and use the word output, and we tend to use the word products when we're talking about manufacturing type of physical production, but the process is exactly the same. What you will notice here, of course, is not only do we have 3 outputs or products that we're coming out of it, but actually we've got project A and project B. So bearing in mind that we don't necessarily have one project delivering one output, producing one outcome to deliver one benefit. It could be that a combination of projects together produce a number of outputs which produce a number of changes. In this example, project B produces output 3 all by itself, and it leads to outcome Y, that change all by itself, and therefore some benefits. But project A doesn't produce outcome X on its own. It needs some input from project B. So referring back to one of the earlier videos when we looked at that 3P governance, we talked about programs, portfolios and projects. This is exactly what we mean. In this example, project A and project B are linked together, and they would form part of a portfolio because both of them would need to be delivered in order to get both of the outcomes and therefore all of the benefits. For the PFQ, you need to understand that relationship. However, the PFQ focuses on one project delivering one or more outcomes, therefore one or more benefits. Okay, so our picture is now starting to come together. We know what the benefits are that we're aiming for. We've decided what the change is that needs to happen, the outcomes. We know what we need to produce, those component parts, those documents. Our next step is to actually work out the individual tasks and the individual things that need to be produced in order to get those products done. So in order to do that, we're going to break those things down into those smaller components. And oddly enough, that's what a breakdown structure does. And as you can see, there's 3 different types here. We've got a work breakdown structure, which is about the tasks and the work that needs to be done. We've got a product breakdown structure, which is breaking down the individual put together devices and products. And we've got a cost breakdown structure as well. We're not going to look at the cost breakdown structure in this video. We're going to save that and look at that when we talk about budgets. But we are going to look at the other 2. So let's start with the product breakdown structure. So whatever our finished product item is, we're going to break that up into all of its different little components. If you imagine that your project is restoring a car or something like that, a car isn't just one thing. It's made up of lots of different pieces. It's got a gearbox, it's got a chassis, it's got the interior, it's got the engine. So we can break our project down into those groups of components. But of course, an engine isn't one thing on its own either. We can break that down too. We may have the alternator and starter motors and all other different components that might be part of that. And then when you look at those, they potentially can be broken down further still. So the idea is we want to break this into chunks, smaller and smaller and smaller, until we get down to individual different parts. And those individual parts we can then manufacture or purchase right down to nuts and bolts if necessary. The idea is that we will break it down to such an extent that we'll end up with one part that we can assign an individual cost to, an individual amount of production time to, and really importantly, one person who's responsible for purchasing or manufacturing or obtaining that particular thing. Now, of course, we might be producing documents instead, so we would break this down to who's going to write that part of the document, who is going to proofread that part of the document. So we do need to break it down as far as we can. Now, this example here is obviously quite simplistic, and it certainly wouldn't work for something like a motor car. These things can get large, they can get enormous, but they capture every single thing that needs to be produced in order for the project to be successful. So to recap that, the product breakdown structure, the PBS, contains every item that needs to be produced, which may include manufactured items, may include documentation, and it may include constructed items. At the very lowest level, we have what we call the product packages. And these are the smallest divisible item for which we can assign an individual budget that we can allocate to an individual person to take care of, or a supplier if we're purchasing them. And they must be discrete, so that is, there's no overlap between the two. And just like before, it's the smallest divisible unit for which we can put time and a budget against, allocated to a single person who's responsible for getting that done, and discrete, must not overlap. Now, unlike the product one, an extra thing that we include here is the fact that they should be of relatively short duration. We should not have one task that takes several weeks. We should break that down into smaller parts. If there's a chance that you can change person mid-task, because maybe somebody goes on annual leave or is off sick or is seconded to another role, if you are able to change person doing that task, your task hasn't been broken down far enough. So now let's look at the work breakdown structure. Immediately you'll notice it looks almost exactly the same except for a few word changes on the diagram. Well, it works in exactly the same way, but rather than being about things we're producing, it's about the work that needs to be done. So instead of talking about products, we're talking about tasks. And as you can see, it works the same. So we break our project down into sections that need to be achieved, and we break those down into smaller and smaller and smaller tasks. And it follows the same rules as the PBS. We're going to break them down into the smallest task we can that one individual can take care of, we can assign a time to, and we can assign a budget to. So individual tasks we can actually give to people. So we're really getting close now to understanding what it is individual people need to do for this project to succeed. So again, each level is clearly identified with what it's about. The lowest level, the right at the bottom of that table, of that chart, is the individual tasks that need to be done. There can be any number of levels. That means these things, as I said with the product breakdown structure, they can be enormous. They include every single task that needs to be done to cover everything required within the scope. So this really is translating those words in the scope into the start of an action plan. What is it we need to do? And of course, once we understand those individual tasks that we can put time, money and people against, we can start to schedule, we can start to do a detailed budget, and we can start to look at our resourcing. And just like before, it's the smallest divisible unit for which we can put time and a budget against, allocated to a single person who's responsible for getting that done, and discrete, must not overlap. Now, unlike the product one, an extra thing that we include here is the fact that they should be relatively short duration. We should not have one task that takes several weeks. We should break that down into smaller parts. If there's a chance that you can change person mid-task, because maybe somebody goes on annual leave or is off sick or is seconded to another role, if you are able to change person doing that task, your task hasn't been broken down far enough. So a hot tip for you, if you are doing your work breakdown structures or product breakdown structures, you may find that one of them serves your purposes better than the other, and you may not need to do two. In the real world, that's fine. Do what works. You may also find that large pieces of paper and trying to do it on a small screen may be difficult for you to actively do a work breakdown structure or a product breakdown structure. What I found works really well is grabbing a pack of post-it notes, finding a big blank wall and laying it out. Put post-it notes on the wall, I can arrange stuff and I can lay it all out using a large space and get a really good idea. And of course, I can move products, I can move tasks around quite easily by moving post-it notes until I'm happy that I've covered everything and that it is structured in a way that makes sense. Then you can take a photograph of it and then use that to replicate for your digital copy that you're going to put into your scope. That does bring us to the end of this particular video on scope for project management. It's quite a large chunk, but it's really important because it's that foundation that we are going to build off of with the rest of our planning. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Hopefully the next video won't be too far behind.